I'm Ali Abunimah, and you're watching the Electronic Intifada live stream. Earlier this week, there was indeed a three-day meeting at the UN headquarters in New York called the High-Level International Conference for the Peaceful Settlement of the Question of Palestine and the Implementation of the Two-State Solution. It was organized by France and Saudi Arabia. And let's start with a clip of UN Secretary General 𝐓𝐡𝐞 𝐄𝐥𝐿 addressing the conference.
Let's be clear. The creeping annexation of the occupied West Bank is illegal. It must stop. The wholesale destruction of Gaza is intolerable. It must stop. Unilateral actions that would forever undermine the two-state solution are unacceptable. They must stop. The two-state solution remains the only framework rooted in international law, endorsed by the Assembly and supported by the international community.
Yeah, so this comes as France leads a new push for recognition of a Palestinian state that has been joined by the UK and now Canada, among other staunch supporters of Israel's genocidal regime. And of course, British Prime Minister Keir Starmer announced that his country will maybe follow France's lead. And so let's take a look at a couple of clips from his announcement on Tuesday. Let's look at that first clip.
On the 7th of October 2023, Hamas perpetrated the worst massacre in Israel's history. Every day since then, the horror has continued. The hostages are still being held today. The Palestinian people have endured terrible suffering. Now, in Gaza, because of a catastrophic failure of aid, we see starving babies, children too weak to stand, images that will stay with us for a lifetime.
So that clip, the reason we'll get to his declaration about the statement, but about recognizing his statement, I just wanted to point out here that the language he uses, this very strong condemnation of the October 7th operation, which he characterizes the worst attack ever on Israel, and how he characterized what was happening to Palestinians in Gaza. He talked about a catastrophic failure of aid. A catastrophic failure of aid. Aid failed? What does that even mean? It's just bizarre. The refusal to name who is actually doing this. Now let's look at him actually talking about a Palestinian state.
Said that we will recognize a Palestinian state as a contribution to a proper peace process at the moment of maximum impact for the two-state solution. With that solution now under threat, this is the moment to act. So today, as part of this process towards peace, I can confirm the UK will recognise the State of Palestine by the United Nations General Assembly in September, unless the Israeli government takes substantive steps to end the appalling situation in Gaza, agree to a ceasefire, and commit to a long-term sustainable peace, reviving the prospect of a two-state solution.
So it's strange there how he's talking about recognizing a Palestinian state as a bargaining chip, and he might not do it if Israel lets in a few more trucks to Gaza. So this for him isn't about any fundamental Palestinian rights. He's prepared to sacrifice his supposed principled commitment to Palestinian statehood if Israel is willing to just ease the starvation for a bit. But the bigger point here is that many people think that this UN conference and these move towards recognition represent support for the Palestinian cause because it sounds good. I've heard people saying, wow, France and Britain and Canada and other countries are going to recognize Palestine. That's a real gain in the minds of many people. And this is reinforced by the staunch opposition of the United States, which denounced the UN move or the UN conference, and we see this in a statement from the spokesperson for Secretary of State Rubio, absolutely excoriating this conference and the announcement of Macron, the French president, that France will recognize a Palestinian state. But I would argue that despite this apparent hostility, the US is very much on the same side as France, Britain, and Canada and the others. The version of Palestinian statehood being pushed at this UN conference and by governments like France, Saudi Arabia, the UK, and other Arab countries is a fundamentally anti-Palestinian project aimed at eliminating resistance to Israeli settler colonialism and ensuring the long-term survival of Israel even after it perpetrates this Holocaust. All you need to do is read the statements and documents from the states involved, and there are a couple I want to look at now that will give us guidance. We have to get down into it a little bit. Let's look first at this headline from the Times of Israel from July 30th. And we can see the headline there. In first, entire Arab League condemns October 7th, urges Hamas to disarm at two-state confab. And we can see that what the Times of Israel reports is that Arab and Muslim countries, including Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Egypt, Jordan, and Turkey, signed a declaration condemning for the first time Hamas's onslaught of October 7th and calling on the Palestinian terror group to release all the hostages it is holding, disarm, and end its rule of Gaza in a bid to end the devastating war in the Gaza Strip. 17 countries plus the 22-member Arab League and the entire European Union threw their weight behind a 7-page text obtained by the Times of Israel, agreed at a United Nations conference. That's the conference we're talking about. They're calling this the so-called New York Declaration. And now here is that 7-page document obtained by the Times of Israel. It's a draft for a so-called outcomes document from this conference. It is co-signed by France and Saudi Arabia as the co-chairs of the conference, or as the conveners of the conference, and is signed by all the co-chairs, which includes the Arab League and the other Arab and Muslim countries named by the Times of Israel. It is addressed to other members of the UN, asking them to endorse the document and to reply by writing to the Saudi mission at the UN no later than September 5th. And the document does indeed contain what the Times of Israel says, a call for a demilitarized Palestinian state under the control of a collaborationist Palestinian Authority. I'm not going to go through the whole document because it's long, but I just want to point out a couple of key paragraphs. And this is paragraph 11. And it says, governance, law enforcement, and security across all the Palestinian territory must lie solely with the Palestinian Authority with appropriate international support. We welcome the one state, one government, one law, one gun policy of the Palestinian Authority and pledged our support to its implementation, including through the necessary DDR process that should be completed within an agreed mechanism with international partners and a set time frame. In the context of ending the war in Gaza, Hamas must end its rule in Gaza and hand over its weapons to the Palestinian Authority. Now, a couple of points about this. DDR stands for disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration. It talks about Hamas disarming and handing over its weapons to the Palestinian Authority in the context of ending the genocide. In other words, this document appears to accept Israel's view that the war, as they would call it, will go on until Hamas is demilitarized and disarmed. Total disarmament of the resistance is to be done before the creation of a demilitarized Palestinian state. Because note that the weapons are to be handed over not to the government of an independent Palestinian state, but to the Palestinian Authority that exists under and collaborates with Israeli occupation. So this is about leaving Palestinians defenseless in the face of a genocidal occupier, first, by disarming any resistance, and second, at some point in the future, creating a demilitarized Palestinian state in name that cannot defend itself. So it's not about Palestinian self-determination, but about fulfilling Israel's war goals under the guise of a peace process. Nowhere does the document talk about disarming Israel. It doesn't even talk about disarming Israel's settlers in the West Bank who continue to terrorize and murder Palestinians every single day. The framework is about creating safety and security for the genocidal settler colony that is perpetrating a Holocaust. I want to look at one more point to illustrate how dangerous and anti-Palestinian this so-called two-state solution framework is. In particular, it seeks to abrogate the right of return of Palestinian refugees to their country and to their homes. And here's paragraph 14 of that same 7-page document co-signed by Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Qatar, Turkey, and the Arab League. It says that I'm just going to read this bit concerning UNRWA. Upon the achievement of a just solution to the Palestinian refugee issue to be agreed upon in accordance with UN General Assembly Resolution 194, UNRWA will hand over its public-like services in the Palestinian territory to empowered and prepared Palestinian institutions. So the document, it talks about achievement of a just solution to the Palestinian refugee issue without mentioning or reaffirming the right of return. And this is long-established peace process code for abrogating the right of return, resettling Palestinian refugees outside Palestine so that Jewish demographic supremacy is not threatened, and at best refugees would get monetary compensation. It makes a passing reference to UN Resolution 194, but this should provide no reassurance since 194 is supposed to be about the right of return, but they don't mention that. They're only interested in the compensation part of 194. Now, this is key. We've all been told for the past 2 years that Israel's efforts to dismantle UNRWA are a red line, and all these governments are saying how they support UNRWA and UNRWA is essential. Well, this document talks about UNRWA, quote unquote, handing over its duties not to the government of an independent Palestinian state, but to what it calls prepared and empowered Palestinian institutions in the Palestinian territory. In other words, all this appears to take place prior to the supposed independence of a Palestinian state. So again, this is a formula for dismantling any international institutions and frameworks that protect Palestinian rights and achieving Israel's war goals under the guise of diplomacy. Now, I'm not going to go into much more detail about this document, which is bad enough, but it gets even worse when you look at a statement published just yesterday, July 30th, by the French Foreign Ministry, making many of the same points and really laying out what the actual agenda is. This is a joint statement from the foreign ministers of Andorra, Australia, Canada, Finland, France, Iceland, Ireland, Luxembourg, Malta, New Zealand, Norway, Portugal, San Marino, Slovenia, and Spain. I'm naming names. A subset of the countries that endorsed that longer document we just looked at. Interestingly, the UK didn't sign it, and perhaps I'll have time to come back to that. It repeats most of the points in that longer UN draft declaration, but it's more explicit and clear about some things, and it should put to rest any idea that these governments have Palestinian rights or interests at heart. So let's just look at a little bit from this statement. It says, we foreign ministers of those various countries I named condemn the heinous and anti-Semitic terrorist attack of October 7th, 2023. Demand an immediate ceasefire, the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages of Hamas, including the remains, as well as ensuring unhindered humanitarian access. Now, let me comment on that. This statement condemns only the Palestinian resistance operation of October 7th, 2023, even declaring it anti-Semitic. I mean, this is just a wholesale regurgitation of the worst Israeli propaganda. This is like calling Irish resistance to British colonialism and savagery, I don't know what, Anglophobia or anti-Scottishism, it's or anti-Protestantism, which is indeed what the British claimed for many centuries. So it's shocking to me in particular that Ireland should sign this. And of course, there is no condemnation of Israel in this statement and no mention of genocide. Let me read on a little bit. These same foreign ministers, quote, reiterate our unwavering commitment to the vision of the two-state solution, where two democratic states, Israel and Palestine, live side by side in peace within secure and recognized borders. And then they stress the importance of unifying the Gaza Strip with the West Bank under the Palestinian Authority. So here, they're declaring their commitment to the continued existence of the entity that is perpetrating genocide under the guise of a two-state solution, in which a non-sovereign Palestinian state will be ruled over by the Vichy-style collaborator regime currently headed by Mahmoud Abbas. They all know when they wrote this statement that the Palestinian Authority works with the occupation. So how can this be about ending occupation if what you want to do is put in charge an entity that collaborates with the occupation? And now here they say a little bit more, I'll read from this, that they express grave concern over the high number of civilian casualties and humanitarian situation in Gaza. Now, listen to that passive language again, just like Keir Starmer. Having explicitly condemned the resistance and only the resistance, they only express vague concern over the mass killing of Palestinians in Gaza and what they call the humanitarian situation without mentioning who caused it, no mention of Israel. And then they go on and say, and this really re-emphasizes what we see in that longer UN document. They say that they, quote, "We welcome the commitments made by the president of the Palestinian Authority, where he condemns the October 7th terrorist attacks, calls for the liberation of hostages and disarmament of Hamas, commits to terminate the prisoner payment system, commits to schooling reform, commits to call for elections within a year to trigger generational renewal, and accepts the principle of a demilitarized Palestinian state." So there you have it. No resistance, no self-defense, and then a state that is completely naked and defenseless in front of Israel. Then they get to talking about recognition, and they point out how a number of countries have already recognized Palestine or plan to, and they say that they urge other countries to consider doing the same. And they say, and I think this is the key point here, that they urge countries who have not done so yet to establish normal relations with Israel and to express their willingness to enter into discussions on the regional integration of the state of Israel. So they use their recognition of a non-existent Palestinian state, that they're doing absolutely nothing to actually bring into existence, as a cover for their real agenda, obtaining full recognition for Israel now, normalization now, and regional integration soon, while it's in the midst of perpetrating a Holocaust. This is about rewarding Israel during its genocide. And finally, they expressed their determination, quote, to work on an architecture for the day after in Gaza, which guarantees the reconstruction of Gaza, the disarmament of Hamas, and its exclusion from the Palestinian governance. So they mention the disarmament of Hamas repeatedly in this document. And they use this Israeli terminology of the day after. And then this emphasizes, of course, that the elimination of Palestinian resistance is the goal, and deciding for Palestinians who will rule them. Again, no mention of disarming Israel or bringing its war crimes fugitive indicted leaders to justice. And then let's just look at the words of the French Foreign Minister, Jean-Noël Barrot, in his speech opening the UN conference. Of course, remember that France and Saudi Arabia are the co-conveners, and why France is recognizing a Palestinian state. So Barrot says, France is prepared to fully recognize the state of Palestine and will do so in September. This recognition, a major decision by France, expresses a refusal and also contains a call, refusing to see the side of war standing victorious over that of peace, refusing to acquiesce to Hamas, which has always disputed Israel's right to exist and which has always fought the two-state solution for that reason. But Palestine is not and will never be Hamas. Recognizing a state of Palestine today means standing with the Palestinians who have chosen nonviolence, who have renounced terrorism, and are prepared to recognize Israel. So you can see that central to French concerns is the recognition of the genocidal state of Israel, securing it, and elevating Palestinians willing to surrender to Israel and collaborate with it. This is not about self-determination or independence for Palestinians. And finally, I want to recall that all this is happening at the UN General Assembly, which last September adopted a resolution endorsing an advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice. That decision came out last July on the legal consequences arising from Israel's policies and practices in the occupied territory. Now, that ICJ decision was celebrated at the time as historic because for the first time it declared Israel's occupation of the West Bank and Gaza Strip, including East Jerusalem, to be illegal in and of itself. And it went even further because it said that all UN member states have an obligation to do everything in their power to bring Israel's occupation to an end as quickly as possible. And effectively, the ICJ called for and endorsed sanctions on Israel. In line with this, the UN passed a resolution, the UN General Assembly passed a resolution last September, which, quote, demands that Israel brings an end without delay. Let me read that again. Demands that Israel brings to an end without delay its unlawful presence in the occupied Palestinian territory, which constitutes a wrongful act of a continuing character entailing its international responsibility, and do so no later than 12 months from the adoption of this present resolution. So September 2024, the UN General Assembly overwhelmingly voted that Israel had 12 months to end its occupation of the West Bank and Gaza Strip, which means that there's 1 month left to that deadline, basically. Instead, what France, Saudi Arabia, the Palestinian Authority, all those Arab states, and their other collaborators are doing is trying to revive an endless peace process in which the Palestinian people and their resistance are the wrongdoers, the aggressors, and the Israelis are the victims, and it is up to the Palestinians to disarm and jump through endless hoops, which, if they are lucky, will end in them being allowed to live under Israeli apartheid forever, which will be given the name of a state. So this is rewarding Israel's genocide and assuring it that no matter what it does, this so-called international community will never hold it accountable and will always blame the Palestinians for their own plight and exonerate Israel. And just in closing, I want to share some other reactions to this. One from our friend, the human rights lawyer, 𝐄𝐥𝐞 𝐄𝐿, and this was his excoriating assessment of this. He said some states gathered at the UN in New York are trying to reanimate the stinking corpse of the Oslo process and the so-called two-state solution. Their goal is not Palestinian liberation, but rather to preserve the genocidal apartheid regime of Israel and its official racist ideology of Zionism. In return, they offer the possibility of a Palestinian Bantustan somewhere down the road. This approach can only extend Palestinian suffering, ensure further conflict, buttress Israeli impunity, and distract attention and effort from addressing the true root causes. It has failed. It will continue to fail. As with apartheid in South Africa, the Israeli regime must be isolated, defeated, dismantled, and replaced with a democratic secular state with equal rights for all from the river to the sea. I couldn't agree more with that assessment by Craig Mukhaibar. And here is what Zara Sultana, a British member of parliament, said. Now, Sultana was until recently a member of the Labour Party, but left the Labour Party to join a new party being formed by Jeremy Corbyn. And this is what she said in response to British Foreign Minister David Lammy's announcement about the planned recognition of the Palestinian state by Britain. And she says, this is a PR stunt that lets Israel's genocide continue. Meanwhile, David Lammy won't expel the Israeli ambassador, end all trade, implement a full arms embargo, stop surveillance flights or UK training of Israeli soldiers. Empty gestures fool no one. He belongs in The Hague. And again, I think that is absolutely right. Why are they at the UN talking about a so-called two-state solution instead of talking about sanctions, instead of holding Israel accountable for failing to meet that UN set deadline to end its occupation within 12 months? And above all, why aren't they doing everything in their power, as they're obliged to do under the 1948 Genocide Convention, to end this genocide? Not one of these countries has imposed an arms embargo, a trade embargo, diplomatic sanctions on Israel. As we've discussed in recent episodes, the European Union has imposed 18 sanctions packages on Russia and has not imposed a single sanction on Israel. So my appeal to people watching and listening to this is, don't be fooled. Don't be distracted. These governments do not have the rights or interests or lives of Palestinians at heart. They can hear your protests, they can hear your anguish and outrage, and they are trying to distract you with this, to pose as champions of Palestinian statehood, when what they're trying to achieve is Israel's goals under the fake guise of a peace process. It has to be exposed as such. Stay on message. This genocide has to end, and they have an obligation to take immediate, practical, active steps to prevent and punish Israel from carrying out this genocide.